Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please switch off your cell phones and stand up for the procession to enter. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Please feel free to sit down. So I'd like to welcome you all here this evening to this inaugural lecture from Professor Karl van Holdt. I'd also especially like to welcome Karl's family, friends and colleagues who are all here this evening. And also I'd like to welcome everybody who's online I hope you can hear me. So inaugural lectures are really very important events in the in the life of the university. They're auspicious occasions, and they really represent the rite of passage into the life of the academy. And so tonight we're going to hear from Karl. He's going to profess on his topic and his contributions, and it's to a non-specialist audience, and that's really the challenge, that Karl's able to impart all of his knowledge and wisdom to us, and also what his contribution has been, and we look forward to hearing that. Sorry, I'm remiss. I should have introduced the procession. I'm Professor Lynn Morris. I'm the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research and Innovation here at Wits. Professor Garth Stevens, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities. Dr. Prashani Naidu, who is the Director of Science, Work and Politics Institute, or more affectionately known as SWAP, Professor Karl, who you're going to hear from shortly. And then the vote of thanks will be given by Professor Michael Baraguanas, who will be joining us online. So with that, I would like to invite Professor Garth Stevens to come forward to introduce our inaugural speaker.
Thank you, Professor Morris. Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Faculty of Humanities, it's really a pleasure to welcome you all here as family members, as friends, as colleagues, members of the Wits community. Those of you who are online, great to have you here, and of course, members of the procession, Professor Morris, Dr. Naidu, Professor Bourdieu, who's, I think, joining us online, but if he's not to join us online, we will see a video clip of him later. And of course, a special welcome to our inaugurating professor, Professor Karl van Holdt. Karl, it's great to eventually kind of be having this moment. I know, so Karl was supposed to do his inaugural some time ago already, but he insisted that we wouldn't do this online during COVID. He wanted a face-to-face, and so he's kind of delayed it and put it off. But I'm really, really pleased that we're able to do this with friends, with family, with colleagues, and so on, in the face-to-face and in fact, a hybrid mode this evening, Karl. So great to be able to do this. As Professor Morris has already indicated, the professoriate is, of course, the apex rank in the institution, but we hope it's not the apex of your intellectual contribution tonight, Karl. I think that, we all anticipate that that apex is going to move for you a little bit. Will always be slightly out of reach, and you'll always be giving us more and really innovating in terms of your own intellectual work. So we're really looking forward to your lecture this evening. It is also a celebratory moment. It's not only a celebratory moment about the rank. It's a celebratory moment for the intellectual contribution that has been made, for your contribution to the academy, for your scholarliness, for your research, your development of students, your activism, your applied policy work, and so on. And certainly we think a lot more. So it's really a celebratory moment for you. So let me actually introduce Karl properly. Karl van Holdt started his working life teaching literacy to trade union members in the hostels and informal settlements of Cape Town in the early 1980s. Before embarking on an academic career, he was the editor of the South African Labour Bulletin, coordinator of COSATU's September Commission on the Future of Trade Unions in 1996 and 1997, was the director on the board of the South African Post Office, worked on a project at COSATU to transform the Chris Hani Baraguanas Hospital, and was appointed to the first National Planning Commission between 2010 and 2015. Karl van Holdt joined Wits University in 2007 and was appointed the director of Society Work and Politics Institute, also known as SWAP, from 2011 to 2018. His current research projects include the July Days social unrest in 2021 and popular politics across the BRICS countries based on international collaborations. His books include Transition from Below, Forging Trade Unionism and Workplace Change in South Africa in 2003, Beyond the Apartheid Workplace, Studies in Transition in 2005, co-edited with Professor Eddie Webster, who's also here this evening. Conversations with Bourdieu, the Johannesburg Moment 2012, that was also co-authored with Michael Bourdieu, and of course the co-edited volume, Critically Engaging Public Sociology, Perspectives from the Global South in 2022 from Bristol University Press. On a more personal note, let me just say, Karl and I have been involved on a particular project as co-PIs for a little while. We've had lots of debates and sometimes fights, and we've discussed everything from structure to agency to subject formation, and we've not always agreed, especially on questions of method, number one, and on how we understand the state. But of course, Karl, if I can say that my interaction with you has always been an enriching one. And, I look forward to many, many more enriching moments like that. And really, we're looking forward to your lecture this evening. So if I can invite you at this point to deliver your inaugural address. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Garth, thanks, Lynn, and thanks everyone, friends, colleagues, comrades, for coming out tonight. We live in a society, let me get my timer, sorry. We live in a society which is continuously being made and remade, made and unmade, through dynamic, contested set of processes which generate confusion, disorder, and violence. This is the idea that I'm talking about tonight. Now, this way of thinking poses difficulties for sociology. Sociology, and the way we're trained into sociology, tends to look for patterns, it looks for structures, it looks for social reproduction, the reproduction of order. So when you're looking at chaos, the making and unmaking, violence, conflict, it's quite difficult to work out how to think them in sociological categories. So this poses the question, it's the question I want to pose tonight, whether seeing the world this way doesn't require us to rethink the categories of sociology, my discipline, to destabilize them, precisely to unmake and remake them. In a way that allows us better to think about a world that is so dynamic and so contested and so changing. Tonight I'm going to talk about I'm going to present, in a sense, stories about 6 different research episodes in my life as a way of reviewing the way my thinking has developed over time. And I'm going to end with some theoretical reflections. But before I proceed to actually talk about my research, I really want to thank Kelebokile, Tadi and team, and Siamo Mapodile, who has promised me that he is going to liven up the movie version of this talk and pan across the audience to see whether you're sleeping or laughing or cheering. So thanks, guys. It's been fantastic working with you. So the first moment that I want to talk about is my PhD moment, which was in the 1990s, but it was really working on the unions in the 1980s and through into the 1990s. And that was a time of huge upheaval and struggle in South Africa. A struggle that was in the townships was based around the idea of ungovernability, of making apartheid ungovernable, precisely unmaking apartheid. But ungovernability didn't go on its own. Ungovernability was combined with its twin, which was the strategy of building people's power. People's power was about building an alternative order, a new South Africa in the ruins of the old, if you like. So it was the strategy of ungovernability and the strategy of people's power. Now, the question that I wanted to ask and that I wanted to explore in my PhD was the question of what does ungovernability mean in the workplace? That hadn't been explored before. So the prevailing analysis of workplace order was very sociological, and it tended to see the workplace as a place where the unions and management were negotiating a new order. Concept, this idea of the negotiation of order, was drawn from the insights of British industrial sociology. I was skeptical. I'd been working with the Labour Bulletin, I'd been working with the unions for a number of years over that period, and it seemed to me that that negotiating order was not really what unions were involved in. That ungovernability had some sort of resonances in the workplace. So that's what I investigated. I went to Witbank and I studied NUMSA in Highfield Steel, huge steel factory. And indeed, I found ungovernability as I'd expected. I found that shop stewards were engaging in a number of different strategies to undermine management control, to rupture management control in the workplace, and that the negotiation of order was simply a form. It wasn't really the substance of what was happening. But I found something entirely unexpected. And this is the kind of wonderful thing about a PhD, you know, is that you suddenly hit something that you hadn't thought about. It's not in your research questions. And gosh, you then change the way you do your PhD. That's my approach to methodology. So I found ungovernability in the trade union. And this ungovernability revolved around a conflict between the formal constitutional structure of the union, which is the shop steward committee, elected according to all the processes in the union constitution, and another committee. It was a committee that was called the strike committee, initially set up to maintain discipline during strikes. It quite rapidly became more and more independent of the shop stewards, and indeed it developed an antagonistic relation to them. And this kind of conflict between the shop stewards and the strike committee was a reflection of the conflicts between township dwellers and hostel dwellers, between more educated workers and less educated workers, speaking in formal terms. That conflict became more and more antagonistic until it broke out in violence. And ultimately, the union split into two: ungovernability of the union, violence, and the making of a union order and the unmaking of union order, all happening, you know, at a very dynamic time in our history and in people's lives. What I found interesting was that in the way shop stewards and the migrant workers talked about the strike committee, the strike committee was also called the Shambok Committee, symbolizing, you know, the violence. And the protagonists of this committee, and sometimes they've been marching into shop steward meetings, 800 strong, people supporting this committee. And the term that they used was, we built this union with the Shambok, and we need the Shambok to continue building the union. The shop stewards argued against this, that the union was built through democracy, and that we need to build it through democracy. So at that point, the union splits into two. So this is a point where I actually want to talk about my first mentor, who was Eddie Webster. So Eddie was the guy who brought me into Wits, ensured that the sociology department was wheelchair accessible, which it wasn't at the time, taught me, supervised me, and then became my colleague and comrade in the Labour Bulletin, which he'd been one of the founding editors of when I became editor of the Labour Bulletin. And then he drew me back into Wits, something that I'd been sort of ducking and diving for a number of years. And at one point he said to me, you know, this is it. If you don't come now, that space is going to be gone for you. So I came into SWAP. Wonderful. And I also want to mention SWAP, which is really a fantastic institute in which one experiences the collective practice of research and analysis. And that's really a point that I want to make very strongly today, is that any ideas I've got have come out of all of these engagements and interactions with colleagues, with students, and with others. It's been a remarkable journey. And in fact, Eddie's been working with me for 40 years now and continues to, as I continue to grow into this discipline. So the second moment is the Chris Hani Baraguanas Hospital moment, 2007, where I'm working with Kusatu, Nahau, the trade unions in a transformation project at the hospital. We were there in 2007. It's a public sector strike and violence breaks out. So I started to discuss with the shop stewards that I was working with, well, why violence now? You know, we've got a new order, democracy, a lot of procedures and so on, why violence? That discussion took me back. They insisted that I had to understand a 1992 strike, which was the hospital strike across Gauteng, which was an extraordinarily violent strike. And it was a moment where the union was not recognized by management and was fighting for that recognition. Management was trying to keep unions out of the public sector. That was part of the apartheid workplace regime, if you like. The strike breakers were recruited from the hospitals. They tended to be Inkatha members, and they were very violent. A number of shop stewards and other worker leaders were assassinated, 6 in the end. And workers actually organized an underground committee to take that fight back to the strike breakers. And 6 strike breakers were killed as well. So this is a very high level of violence, you know, through a 4-month strike that ultimately ended in a victory for the union. It was recognized. But that strike, the reason why it was so violent was it was taking place at a particular moment in South Africa, which was a moment of negotiation for democracy, which is what everyone always remembers, but also of the most intense violence, where regime forces were attacking the democratic movement and the democratic movement was trying to defend itself. And so this was a period of real turmoil and struggle, which produced 2 years later a democratic constitution. So I want to argue there that this national process of making democracy, making a new order, ending apartheid, was protracted, chaotic, and violent. And it was constituted by numerous local struggles that were equally protracted, violent, chaotic, that made up this bigger moment of a transition to a new order, a new South African order, as well as a new workplace order. So the 2007 strike that we found ourselves in the middle of, you know, the 2007 strike, public service strike, which was also violent, not as violent as the 1992 strike, but nonetheless, when I was discussing this with workers, they talked about, on the one hand, the extreme aggression of management and the employer, meaning government, the ANC government, on the one hand, and the fact that the promises of freedom had not been met for them. They felt that, you know, freedoms were still had to be fought for, and hence violence became part of that struggle. I concluded from that the new order, the matter of the new order, the new post-democratic order, well, democratic order, was not a settled matter. It was still unsettled, it was turbulent, and it was contested. It didn't have legitimacy across the board. And violence becomes, again, part of the making and unmaking of this order. The third moment of research is the Marikana Moment. And here I'm drawing on a student at SWAP, the work of Crispin Chingunu, I don't know if he's here. He was going to be trying to be here. But anyway, so he did this wonderful piece of research in Marikana. He happened to be at Implats, which was the first of the mining companies that was hit by strikes then, doing his research on strike violence. But Implats was going to be the case where there wasn't going to be strike violence. 3 weeks later, the strike broke out. And within a matter of a week, I think, workers had established a committee that they called the Violence Committee, in an amazing repetition of what had happened at Highfield Steel and what had happened, in the 1992 strike. And they organized violence against scabs again. Workers actually went out, they didn't trust their union anymore. So one of the things that Crispin surfaced in his research was the way the union had become incredibly institutionalized. Shop stewards, for example, actually had become full-time shop stewards and were employed by the company on rates, paid by the company, on rates that were more than what their members were getting. So there was a way in which they were being paid and brought into the company. They worked from offices in the HR department. They were on a career track into management. On top of that, they had a lot of opportunities for bribes and small tenders and contracts and so on. To get a job, you had to pay a bribe, stuff like that. So shop stewards were no longer trusting the union and the shop stewards. They felt they were compromising too much. A direct echo of the strike committee's critique of the shop stewards in the 1980s. When management insisted that they would only negotiate through the union, which is what the LRA says, that you need to negotiate with the union, not with workers on their own. Workers assaulted shop stewards and drove them out of the company. They were not going to work through the union at all. After 6 weeks, they won quite an amazing victory, actually. And then a few weeks after that, the Lonman strike broke out. It was much more violent. 10 people died, including police officers, security guards, and workers. And a few days after that, the Marikana massacre happened, where government actually shot down and killed, police shot and killed 35 striking workers. Now, it seemed to me that the actions of the workers there, threw the entire labor relations order into question. And not only that, but also the entire democratic order. A democratic order that shoots 35 workers who are not a legal strike, but not an illegal strike. They're not breaking the law, is not a model of democracy. Likewise, the fact that workers killed people is not something that normally one associates with a democracy. So thus, over a 30-year period, you see processes of making the union accompanied by violence, processes of unmaking the union and remaking it, also accompanied by violence. Ultimately, the union is remade into a very institutional form, and workers respond with the violence against the union and their own autonomous committees, making a different form of worker organization. Now, all of this work in which violence kind of surfaces as a constant thread through union formation led me to explore rethinking violence. So it seemed to me, and this came across very strongly in what shop stewards said to me. In one case, shop stewards said, if workers have voted for a strike, that's the majority of workers, that's a democratic decision. So everyone is bound by that decision. Anyone who breaks that decision is breaking the law of the strike and breaking the law of the union. And this led me to think, and we found this is widespread. I mean, everywhere, even strike breakers who were beaten up and landed up in hospital would say, we knew the risk we were taking because the right thing is actually to beat up strike breakers. So I developed out of this the idea of local moral orders, a kind of moral order that accompanies the strike. And essentially, it's to recognize the fact that violence isn't amoral, it's not immoral, it's actually embedded in a morality. Violence has its own morality. And in this case, there's a local moral order that emerges. I call it local in distinction from the official national law and morality, this emerges as something that's justified. You can beat up and in certain cases even kill workers who break this law of the majority. So that's the third research moment. So the fourth research moment is our Melusi Langa and my own work, and with other colleagues as well, on protest, which was published in what's become quite famous, The Smoke That Falls, about community protests and xenophobic violence. So, what I want to argue is that continuing the fall from democratic grace that my account so far has charted, there was a wave of xenophobic pogroms in 2008 where some 60-odd people died. And in 2009, a wave of community protests attended by violence in many cases. So SWAP entered into a partnership with the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. And we undertook this, and that's where I met Melusi, and we undertook this research together. Now, we found that a really complex set of dynamics in community protests, the kind of pattern that emerged across, I don't know, I think it was 6 different case studies. Yes, there were militant protests. Sometimes up to 10,000 residents of a local, in a local township would be marching on council offices, demanding that their grievances be attended, demanding that they be heard. That was always like the first problem, was that no one would listen to them. But demanding that a problem with water, a problem with electricity, the lack of housing, the lack of jobs, that these would be addressed. So there was clearly popular support for this mass struggle against problems that people have become very, very frustrated about. But there were extremely murky political dynamics inside of these protests. It became clear that, well, it became clear, I mean, it wasn't so clear, actually, it was quite difficult to thread our way through this, but there were multiple agendas, multiple different agendas in these protest moments, different layers to the protest. There's different groupings, different networks with different interests joined in and shaped their direction. We found not such obvious kind of network links, I can put it that, connections, links between different individuals in the protest. Often clandestine connections, unexpected ones. And so in an effort to make sense of this, we developed the concept of the dual nature of protest, where protests consisted on the one hand of a kind of insurgent citizenship, where people were struggling for their rights, struggling for justice. And on the other hand, a kind of elite jockeying. I mean, I call it elite, but people who were prominent in the local ANC, but didn't necessarily have a job, didn't necessarily have a car, but were looking for opportunities, who were jostling, competing to actually get control of the local government and get access to those committees, those resources. So for them, the goal was get rid. Morris, please don't send the photographs to me. I thought I'd muted my phone, but and I needed to be on. But where was I? I was with this with I think the elites. I mean, they in many cases the demand of the protests was that councillors resign and new councillors be elected because the councillors were corrupt or they weren't listening or whatever. And it was clear that figures in the protests wanted to replace those councillors with themselves or with their own proxies so that they could kind of get control of tenders and other resources in the local government. So there, the dual nature of protest, the combination of elite and insurgent kinds of interests. That's the fourth moment. I should think that by now, you're getting a kind of, let me put it this way, a dark picture, a dark and violent, a dark and stormy night, yes, a dark picture of what of South Africa that emerges through my research. And I've always said, like, I'm the harbinger of bad news. That's what I bring. But actually, there was this fantastic case that was also in the Smoke That Calls, where Malusi and I found a community called Bokfontein, which is sort of off in the middle of nowhere, very marginal community, no resources, no services from any kind of municipality or whatever. Two different communities that had been relocated there and had shacks. Now, this was an amazing community because of the completely different way it was organized and what it was doing. Working together with the government's community works program, they were rebuilding the community. The community was, in a sense, taking charge of its own fate. So through community works program, they were able to employ unemployed people in the community to work on public projects that the community had decided they needed. For example, there was a big community food garden, and there was also a communal kitchen where the crops from that garden were cooked, and for creches, for schools, and also for ill people who were stuck at home and couldn't go out. They built a road through the settlement, and that was a complicated process. They had to move shacks and so on, and they had to negotiate that with people. But they built a road. One of the things they said is that an ambulance can't come in. If there's a problem in the community, the ambulance stops outside. They won't come in. They don't have a road. They built roads. They built a people's park. And they said to us, it's really important for people to be able to relax in nature. Those are kind of the vision of something different, something alternative. But maybe more important than this kind of collective material rebuilding of the community was their opposition to violence. They said quite explicitly, we don't support violence here. This community, which was made up of two different groupings, had a very intense actual experience of violence. These two communities were competing with each other, and there was a lot of violence between them. People died, people were robbed, people were injured. And through the community work program and through the NGO, Sariti, which was actually training them for the program, they were able to discuss this and work through it and discover a process of building their own solidarity, of overcoming that violence, of seeing themselves as one community. Not only that, but during those xenophobic pogroms that I mentioned, agitators, if I can put it that way, from nearby communities came to Bokfontein and tried to mobilize people to join the xenophobic attacks on foreigners. And the people in the community said, no, we don't do violence here. And we're not xenophobic in this community. Now, this was an extraordinary kind of case of, and in fact, one of the strengths of the community was that it was so derelict and far from anything that there were not even political parties were organized there. In fact, at one point, the EFF came and tried to take over the community work program because they thought there was money and resources. And after a couple of months, they came back to the leaders and they said, actually, we can see there's nothing here, so you take it back and we're leaving. So, it's a miserable idea about what politics, what politicians do in community. Anyway, so that provides a kind of a view of an alternative from below, the organizing of an alternative order from below that offers some idea, some notion of what a different future might look like, a kind of a possible trajectory for our country. And this is not the only one. I mean, I'm thinking of those workers' autonomous committees on the mines that I mentioned. And then also the Fees Must Fall student movement here on campus, where a whole cluster of new and liberatory ideas emerged. Ideas about not being represented by political movements, but actually simply representing us as a student movement. Ideas about rejecting hierarchy and rejecting a kind of a structured leadership, which they felt would, apart from anything else, would always be co-opted into political organizations. Ideas of radical Black feminism and intersectionality that we hadn't seen before in movements. Now, these various kind of alternatives that start to emerge, they remind me actually of what the project of people's power was about in the 1980s. The project of trying to build an alternative or envisage an alternative in the midst of a real battle with the current order and a battle to protect for communities to protect themselves from the current order of things. So that's the fifth research case. Oops. No matter, that's history. So if I can just check this, yeah. The sixth research case that I want to talk about is really what I've been working on now, most recently, and that is on corruption. So it strikes me when I look back at all of this research, there's a kind of pattern across all these different sites, communities, unions, the state, local government, a pattern of corruption, a pattern of elite formation, a new Black elite attempting to create itself, in very harsh conditions. Patronage politics, where factions form and gains are distributed down a network of patronage, and violence. These emerge right across the cases that I've been studying, except perhaps for Bokfontein. And this led me to identify the emergence of a new order in South Africa. I could call it a new political hyphen economic order, the patronage violence complex. And the making of this, I've traced in my research, I am tracing in my research, the making of this alternative order, the making of the patronage violence complex, which is a process through which a new elite forges itself, makes itself, through forming into factions and using state institutions to accumulate wealth, where there's very little other opportunity to accumulate wealth, where in many ways the accumulation of wealth has been monopolized by whites, and still is by whites and by the corporate sector and so on. And violence is integral to this process because the competition to access those resources is a very ferocious one. It's a fierce competition. And ultimately, violence gets deployed to try and ensure access and prevent others from getting access. This led me to the concept of violent democracy. This is a way of thinking about violent democracy. So we've still got democracy in this country. But the interesting thing, the disturbing thing about democracy is that increasingly, national elections are accompanied by spikes in violence. There's violence over who gets to be a candidate in local government elections, who gets to be a candidate in provincial government. Assassinations have been a kind of rising trend, as well as violence in meetings that get broken up, meetings that can't be held. Democratic institutions themselves become the occasion and the site of violence. So that's the sixth kind of area that I'm working on that draws a thread through the other six, the other five research stories that I've told. This brings me now to the question of destabilizing theory, remaking theory. Guys, you haven't been timing me, but I'm actually in a situation where I'm getting to the end before I should. I don't know if that's happened before, but I'm fine. Okay. I'll have to think of something to say. But I said right at the beginning, that this different sense of South African society that emerges through through the work that I and colleagues have done, suggests the necessity to rethink the conceptual apparatus that we find in sociology, that apparatus which we inherit. I've given an early example of that by talking about the concept of ungovernability in the workplace, where British industrial sociology and its insights about the negotiation of order were effectively imposed actually on the South African workplace, and became a way of misrecognizing, misunderstanding the dynamics at play there. And it became essential to rethink that and challenge that. It also became necessary to rethink the trade union and what the trade union is. So in thinking about this kind of set of studies, events, practices, the Latin American scholars are often the most useful, I've found. I'm thinking of Javier Aullero and his concept of the gray zones of politics, which describes pretty closely the kind of murky political world that I mentioned earlier. And he, in turn, is building on Guillermo O'Donnell's concept of brown zones of politics. And then there's James Holston with his fantastic work on Brazil and disjunctive democracy, a transition to democracy, which is disjunctive and in which you get, again, many different kinds of struggles taking place, many different kinds of orders emerging, and violence accompanying all of these. So that is a set of theorists that I've worked with a bit, but I then found myself turning to Pierre Bourdieu, an extremely unlikely theorist, and I'll tell you why. But I was introduced to him by, not to him, but to his work, by Michael Baraguanas. And Michael is the second mentor that I want to mention, because Michael has been an inspiration and also a sounding board for my own intellectual journey over the past 20 years, starting off with actually examining my PhD. When I became director of SWAP, he opened international doors for me, helped me to do, it felt to me like I was gate crashing international events, put me on plenary forums, introduced me to international journals and so on, and really helped me to grow through all of that. But it's been a real source of encouragement when he thinks that I'm thinking in or writing or saying interesting things. But I also know that when I see him pull a face, it means he thinks I'm talking nonsense. And that's sort of forced me back to the drawing board. And in fact, I remember, Eddie, at your farewell colloquium, I gave a paper that Michael pulled a real lemon of a face. And in some ways, what I'm presenting tonight, is in some ways the answer to what I was trying but failing to do, back then. He came to Wits and he presented a series of lectures on Pierre Bourdieu, who he was really grappling with quite closely at the time. Now, Pierre Bourdieu, why did he fascinate me? I think it's the meticulous attention that he pays to processes of making order and reproducing order that is central to Bourdieu's work. He develops a cluster of concepts which help him to think about order. Concepts like the field of action, what they call violence, symbolic violence, and habitus. Now, the thing that happens in this kind of very detailed and sensitive account of the subtleties of order-making processes is that it becomes impossible to imagine disorder. It becomes impossible to see where in society that he describes it would be possible for resistance to occur, for some kind of alternative to be imagined, because everyone in the society is so incorporated, is so interpolated into the workings of that society. Now, that's obviously contrasts enormously with what I've been researching, which is resistance, contestation, and violence. But I found myself intrigued by what he was doing, what he is doing, and trying to work out how one could rethink this. So it opened up the necessity for reconstruction. So in a sense, I mean, there are other sociologists have said to me, "What are you doing messing around Bourdieu? It doesn't work in South Africa." I wasn't trying to apply Bourdieu to South Africa. I was trying to use Bourdieu as a kind of a lens for thinking about South Africa, a lens of order for thinking about disorder, but at the same time, use the continuously emerging and re-emerging disorder in South Africa to rethink Bourdieu. So I was sort of trying to establish a kind of a conversation, an argument, if you like, between South Africa and Bourdieu. So, I mean, that opened up the possibility of, well, is it useful to rethink Bourdieu, to reconstruct him, to actually transform that theory? And I decided to start with the field of practice. Now, the field of practice is his concept for social structure, which empowers and constrains the way people act. So he sees a number of fields everywhere: the political field, the religious field, what other fields are there? Cultural fields of various sorts. And he finds the rules of those fields. And his metaphor, his analogy for this is that it's like playing a game of sport. Like when two teams, come onto the field, cricket, football, rugby, they all know they know how the game's played. They know instinctively, they know bodily how that game is played, what its rules are, and they can sense what the opponents are going to do, and they all play according to these rules. And you don't transgress the rules. But people don't even, there are rules that are transgressed on the margins, but by and large, a rugby player plays rugby. He doesn't go onto the field with a cricket bat. It doesn't, which would be chaos. No, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in Bourdieu, but in my work, it does happen. So this kind of structure, this social structure, this field of practice has a sort of singular logic, which generates a predictable set of outcomes. Our research into local politics, though, revealed multiple contradictory logics, not a singular logic, contradictory logics and practices, producing an opaque politics, the continuous production of disorder in which nothing was clear, least of all to the participants themselves. So my reconstruction of Bourdieu then took the form of replacing the idea of a single field, like a single political field, which constrains what is done in the field of politics, with the idea of multiple fields of practice in the same social site. So in the political sphere, there are multiple fields of practice that contradict each other, that overlap each other, that interpenetrate each other. And each has got its own distinctive and contending notions of order, all occupying the same social space and leading to unpredictability and in some cases disorder and chaos. Now, disorder also is a concept that sociology finds it difficult to think. And it seems to me that through working like this, one can find a concept of disorder that is created out of several different contending emergent notions of order, contradictory notions of order. And I'm going to tell you two stories that come from our research to illustrate to illustrate what I'm talking about. The first is about the speaker and the mayor. Now, this is referring to the speaker of a town council and the mayor in that same town council. They were not on speaking terms. They were competing with each other, and they were actually representative of two contending factions, well, it seemed like two contending factions in the town council. The speaker, as part of the sort of struggle against the mayor, he wanted to become the mayor, fed information, allegations about corruption to members of the ANC Youth League in the community who were mobilizing protests against the mayor. And indeed, they used those allegations, they used those as stories to tell in the community that intensified the protests, and eventually the mayor was forced to resign by the ANC. The speaker, however, didn't benefit from this. Unbeknownst to him, the ANC Youth League activists were opposed to him as well, because he was a representative of the Communist Party. And there was an escalating tension between the Communist Party and the ANC Youth League in Mpumalanga at the time. His house was petrol bombed and burnt down, leaving him extremely angry, saying that his family had been traumatized, and he was bound, as a man, he was bound to use this violence in retaliation. But the point that I want to make about it is that this kind of instability, double meaning, expediency that actors are using, playing in different fields at different times in order to try and gain the edge on other players who may be playing according to different rules. So in this particular case, the mayor was a woman and had been appointed in terms of ANC policy, and she played absolutely by the kind of constitutional democratic methods and rules. And in fact, that municipality won a prize as being one of the best governed municipalities in Mpumalanga. And then a little while later, she's targeted and she's ignominiously forced out of office and actually, in a sense, banished. I mean, she's shunned by all other activists in the community. Whereas this guy, the speaker, plays by the dirty rules, and the dirty rules are so dirty that they trip him up and he also falls foul of them. The second story is about a woman called Noma Zulu. And I want to trace her political career from crime fighter to political activist to criminal. So we first met her in a settlement called Tsietsi, Trouble, in Ekurhuleni. She was very poor, living in a very poor section of the community. She was working, the only kind of occupation she had kids, but her occupation was to be a street patroller for the CPF. And in that, she was very successful. And so in that sense, she was playing the game of the constitutional democracy in Tsietsi. And she said to us then, and it's a really striking, I think, a striking comment, there are pastors, there are presidents, and I believe fighting crime is my calling. I know I have made a very big difference in this community as far as crime is concerned. I'm a brave woman. I'm very brave. I know I am. Facing intimidation from criminals, corrupt cops, etc., etc. This public visibility led to her a couple of years later being elected as the branch secretary of the ANC. When we met her in that, and she was in that position, she was quite an embittered woman. She said, I have lobbied for comrades, been to nice hotels, for conferences, but look how we live. We are poor. They see you, but you are just a nobody. I've seen it all, nice hotels and all the money used to pay for Congress. But the ANC is rotten with corruption, and you can stay being principled, but poor. So she wasn't actually brought into the inner circles. She didn't find a way of benefiting from the corruption that she saw all around her, and she was quite embittered by this. 2 years later, she's elected into the local Sanko executive, the civic organization. And shortly after that, she's charged with fraud for selling an RDP plot to someone who wanted a place to build a house. And she fled the community. So here again, so she moves from this field of constitutional democracy, of that kind of practice, into the field of the patronage violence complex. Can't find a space there. Tries to find a space when she's in the civic organization. Does what others do. but doesn't have the protection of important people, and most importantly, of important men. And this is the working of another field that operates, in these kind of spaces, which is the field of patriarchy. So thus her career, from crime fighter to political activist to criminal in the eyes of the law. So I want to argue that my reconstruction of Bourdieu sheds light on the problem of disorder. It restores individual agency. There's multiple fields to choose from. And in fact, some players play in several different fields at the same time. It makes sense of individual trajectories in the way that I've tried to do with those stories. And then if we step back a little bit, it demonstrates a method for the unmaking and remaking of theory in the global south, the unmaking and remaking of Bourdieu. So that really brings me to the conclusion. Yes, okay, pretty much on time, a couple of minutes late. So this inaugural lecture has provided me with an opportunity to reflect on my research over a 30-year period. It's something that I've really enjoyed doing. And in the process, I've sort of surfaced the ideas of the making and unmaking of multiple contending orders in South Africa. Key elements that are part of the pattern across all these different sites are processes of elite formation or class formation as a new black ruling class struggles to emerge and to make itself in conditions which are pretty difficult. Also, the thread of violence runs through all of the case studies. And as I promised, Garth, Brett, where was Brett? There, Brett, and Malusi. I think the point is that violence is intrinsic to processes of order making and order breaking in society. And so I want to argue that the fact that we are so violent, we have so much violence here in South Africa, is not a surprise. It's intrinsic to these processes. And that's what explains the high levels in South Africa. Order making and order breaking is such a constant dynamic and such a dynamic, if I could put it that way, in the sense that it's always new things are happening where orders are being broken down and other orders constructed. And violence is a tool most of the time, except in Bokfontein. And then so, but I also want to say, in case again it sounds like, why are we living in South Africa? Well, South Africa is not unique. The same kind of thing is happening in many countries in the global south. Think Mexico, think Brazil, think India. But not only that, I think the same things are beginning to emerge in countries of the global north. Think the so-called insurrection at the capital. Think the kinds of election struggles that are taking place in Europe. So it seems to me that this is something that can be developed further when one looks at many places in the world, not only South Africa, and perhaps our own chaos allows us to see things in other countries that other people don't see. So having arrived at this point in my reflection, a host of new questions arise, and that is the fate of the scholar, to believe that one is answering a whole set of questions and find that underneath them, there's like scorpions under a rock. There's a whole new set of questions come to plague one. Like, what does this analysis mean for sociological theory? Can it resolve the agency structure problem in sociology, which is regarded as one of the central problems? And maybe I can just say, this is a small, tiny anecdote. When I was working on my PhD, I sort of got the feeling that unlike in many other places where people were studying trade unions, that in South Africa, there's a surfeit of agency, that it sort of overflows to banks, that it's kind of wild, the way, Shop Steward Committee engaged in, difficult, tough struggles against management. Then there's a strike committee struggling against the Shop Steward Committee. And as soon as that settles down, something else rears its head. It's not like we have a problem of agency in South Africa. Perhaps you've got a problem with structure. And so finally, the final question that emerges is, can this way of thinking help us to dig into and understand the July days riots that happened last year? That's a current research project I'm working on with friends. So I'm going to, with colleagues across Wits and elsewhere. So I want to end with the final question. And I want to recall an activist. He was a member of the SACP, he was a trade unionist. He was a very, very good friend and colleague of mine. We did a lot of the community research together. He wasn't in the university, but he was intrigued by the same kinds of questions I was. And he should have been here. He's not. He took his own life 10 years ago. It's something that shouldn't have happened. So speaking in a way for him or to him or with him, I want to ask, as activists and as citizens, how do we make our own contributions to producing the alternative future orders that may sustain and liberate us? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Van Holdt. Karl, that was great. Always good to hear you talk, and certainly giving us a wonderful account of your own intellectual journey on the one end, but also a really, really complex matter on the other end. When we talk about the question of violence, not only in South Africa, but across the globe today. I mean, I don't want to say too much about it because, of course, Michael's going to respond, but just to say that this kind of idea of order and disorder, disruption and generativity, living cheek by jowl, I think is something really important to consider if one thinks about violence as a social resource that's perhaps ontologically embedded in modernity. Yeah, and when you talk about the idea of violent democracy, of course, it does start to raise the very question. We're getting to the terrain that I was alluding to early on when I introduced you about the nature of the state, the relationship between the state and violence itself. So, and then wonderful to hear, you know, again, not only the stories about Highveld Steel, Barra, Marikana, Bokfontein, and so on. I know that you were a little worried that you were going to be pitching too high or too low. But with a complex question like this, I think you showed us both the kind of theoretical resources and intellectual genealogies that you've drawn upon, and at the same time told us the stories of your journey. So thank you very, very much. I think let's give him another round of applause. I'm not sure if Professor Bourdieu is with us online at the moment, Kelly. Right. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much. Colleagues, I'm now going to really call on Professor Michael Bourdieu to deliver the response, the vote of thanks, what is often referred to as the vote of thanks to the inaugurating professor. But let me introduce him very briefly. Professor Michael Bourdieu has been a participant observer of industrial workplaces in 4 countries, Zambia, the United States, Hungary, and Russia. And in his different projects, he has tried to illuminate, from the standpoint of working class people, post-colonialism, the organization of consent to capitalism, the peculiar forms of class consciousness and work organization in state socialism, and finally, the dilemmas of transition from socialism to capitalism. Over the course of 4 decades of research and teaching, he's developed the extended case method that allows broad conclusions to be drawn from ethnographic research. When he was no longer able to work in factories, he turned to the study of his own workplace, the university, to consider the ways in which sociology itself is produced and then disseminated to diverse publics. His advocacy of public sociology has generated much heat in many a cool place. Throughout his sociological career, he has engaged with Marxism, pursuing its reconstruction in the light of his research, and more broadly, in the light of the historical challenges of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Most recently has been studying the life and work of W.E.B. Du Bois with a view to his significance both for sociology and for Marxism. And he's been president of the American Sociological Association, the International Sociological Association, and founding editor of the magazine Global Dialogue, and co-chair and secretary of the Berkeley Faculty Association. I'm going to ask Professor Bourdieu to just put in his camera. I know that Prof, you've I think recorded your response and thanks already, and so we'll play that in a moment. But I did want you to just be present in the room with us, even if it's virtually, and to thank you very, very much for the kind of collegial relationship that you've clearly had with Professor van Holdt over many, many years, but also for your response this evening. So thank you very, very much.
It is both an honor and a pleasure to offer a vote of thanks to Karl van Holdt on the occasion of his inaugural lecture, and to recognize his exceptional contributions both to sociology and the labor movement. I'm very sorry not to be with you, but the uncertainties of COVID have proved very challenging. My remarks are divided into 4 encounters with Karl van Holdt, each a decade apart. If my memory serves me well, I first met Karl van Holdt in July of 1990. It had been an exciting year. Mandela had walked to freedom. Secret negotiations for the end of apartheid were underway. Joe Slovo had just delivered his qualified critique of the Communist Party that was unbanned after 40 years underground. Jubilation was in the air. Karl was then editor of the South African Labour Bulletin and deeply embedded in the burgeoning labour movement. It was a busy time as 1990 saw continuing strikes and community protests against apartheid designed to make South Africa ungovernable. After a decade immersed in the turbulent transition in post-Soviet Russia, my second encounter with Karl was in 2000 on the occasion of the completion of his dissertation. It would become the basis of his book, Transition from Below, Forging Trade Unionism and Workplace Change in South Africa. It was the summation of his participant observation, as well as his observant participation, in the labour movement between 1980 and 1996. The dissertation was an extraordinary documentation and analysis of the struggles against apartheid, but also the struggles within the labour movement between the township-based shop stewards trying to create a democratic workplace and the more militant migrants from the hostels who were demanding more immediate change. Karl has already summarised the significance of that study for the making and unmaking of post-apartheid South Africa. But here I'd like to emphasise its novelty for theories of transition, very much in vogue at the time. Scholars of Latin America were focused on the ongoing single transition from dictatorship to democracy, analysing the negotiation among elites, political elites as the political scientists called them. In Eastern Europe, there was a double transition. On the one hand, from an administered economy to a market economy, and on the other hand, from a one-party authoritarianism to multi-party democracy. Again, it was a transition negotiated from above. Karl, on the other hand, wrote of a triple transition from apartheid, a political and economic transition, but also a post-colonial transition. But even more to the point, South Africa was exceptional in that the working class was the dynamite that brought down the old order, posing the question of its place in forging the new order. As his lecture today has demonstrated, this triple transition has been fraught from the beginning by the violence it necessarily entailed. Karl brings to mind Frantz Fanon's account of decolonization in his famous The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon too was concerned with the dilemmas of unmaking and remaking, overthrowing colonialism and building the post-colony. Challenging apartheid with its massive repressive apparatus required a violent confrontation that gained momentum after World War II, reaching its climax in the 1980s. The building of the post-colony, however, entailed a struggle for hegemony among the erstwhile colonized. That is a struggle between the social forces behind a national bourgeois road and those behind the national liberation struggle. For Fanon, basing himself on Algeria, the national liberation struggle for socialism was energized by a volcanic peasantry. In South Africa, however, the national liberation struggle would be given impetus by a militant working class, a class Fanon had identified as a labor aristocracy parasitic on the national bourgeoisie. As we have heard from Karl, the making and the unmaking of the new South Africa involved the formation and reformation or reformation of a bourgeois class and the radical challenges it continues to face from below. But there's another difference between von Holt's and Fanon's analyses. Where Fanon considered violence would dissipate once the old colonial order collapsed, von Holdt was only too aware that once violence is unleashed, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Here lies another crucial contribution of Karl's sociology, how to understand the coexistence of violence and democracy. Inspiration came from an unexpected source. Karl's reconstruction of the work of Pierre Bourdieu, that erudite French sociologist of global fame. Thus it was that 2011 became my third encounter with Karl. I was giving lectures here on imaginary conversations between Bourdieu and various Marxists when Karl, then director of SWAP, rescued my arid presentations with brilliant commentaries on the relevance of Bourdieu to South Africa. How could that be? Leaving aside his work on colonial Algeria, how could Bourdieu's focus on reproduction, on cultural domination, on distinction, on the inability of the dominated to understand the conditions of their domination, on how the embodied and embedded habitus prevent challenges to their social order? How can this sociology of order be of relevance to the turbulence of South Africa? You might well ask. But at the end of every lecture, Karl came up with novel connections, whether by paying attention to hidden dimensions of South African society or by turning Bourdieu upside down. How does one turn a theory of order into a theory of disorder? Bourdieu's theory of history turns on the development and differentiation of fields of social interaction. Fields such as education, economy, politics, religion, law, and various cultural fields. Each field is a terrain of contest between actors mobilizing resources, what Bourdieu calls capital, to achieve or maintain domination within the field. Karl transforms this model of differentiation by showing how in South African reality fields overlap with one another so that individuals are simultaneously playing in multiple fields. The constitutional order of liberal democracy overlays the struggles for resources in the field of patronage violence that overlays an insurgent order of popular social movements. We have a vertical layering of fields rather than a horizontal differentiation, and of course, a much more indeterminate history. Working with Bourdieu against Bourdieu proved to be a brilliant and dramatic break with conventional sociology that has devoted so much attention to the question of social order, accomplished through value consensus, the inculcation of norms, or through functional analysis of institutions, or through coercion. Only Marxism possessed an adequate theory of social change where the reproduction of capitalism is simultaneously its transformation, where competition among capitalists leads simultaneously to the concentration of capital, and thus economic crises, and the polarization of classes. This theory, even in its novel application to South Africa, has a problem. It's wrong. In its orthodox variant, it is blind to a whole set of institutions that refract, redirect, and sever the connection between crises and struggles. Bourdieu understands this, but bends the stick too far in the direction of societal order. Karl is bending the stick back. But in this bending of the stick. Karl is not seeking some indigenous sociology as an alternative to sociology emanating from the North. Rather, recognizing the hegemony of Northern sociology within the global field, Karl is fighting back on its terrain by localizing Bourdieu's theory to suit local conditions and, if necessary, inverting that theory. And it is in this way, working with Bourdieu against Bourdieu, a distinctive South African sociology emerges. Let me illustrate this with my fourth and last encounter with Karl. Together with his colleagues, Andries Bezuidenhout and Samwambili Mwana, Karl has just put together a book criticizing public sociology in the name of critical engagement. Critical engagement is a research practice pioneered by SWAP, the world-renowned Labour and Development Centre here at Wits. In the SWAP tradition, the researcher leaves academia to engage directly with the world. In so doing, they are committed to the goals of a particular organisation or movement. But at the same time, they are faithful to evidence, to judgment, and to their conscience. This is a sensitive operation, but one that marks the history of SWAP. This methodology has flourished at SWAP, beginning with Karl's mentor, Eddie Webster, but it is more broadly a characteristic of South African sociology, and perhaps even Southern sociology. Why might this be the case? It could, of course, be the genius of SWAP scholars, and I genuinely believe that there is much truth to that. But let us be more sociological. Is there something about SWAP, or the South African University, that predisposes sociology toward critical engagement? Here I return to Karl's reconstruction of Bourdieu, the layering of fields. The university, of course, is an academic field, a field of competition organized around research and teaching. But the university lies in a second field, an economic field of scarce resources in which the university depends on fees, government subsidies, and cost-cutting. Struggles in this field reverberate into the academic field. And then superimposed on these two fields, there is a third field. We might call it a political field, involving struggles around decolonization and social justice. And this further disrupts the other two fields. This perpetual crisis threatens the autonomy of the university so that the social sciences cannot escape the world of politics and social justice, even as you struggle to retain autonomy, even as you struggle to retain a critical distance. This radical disarticulation of fields sprang to life in the fees must fall insurgency. In short, the South African university is critically embedded in society, and sociology reflects that embeddedness. This is why South African sociology is exceptional, why it is so fraught and tense, and why it is so exciting and yet so demanding, why South African sociologists become windmills caught in a maelstrom. I leave you, therefore, with this question. Does the South African university point to the future of the university in general? No less in the north than in the south, buffeted by the gales of neoliberalism, the polarization of politics, and battles around decolonization. I look forward to the answer to this question in my fifth encounter with Karl in the year 2030. Thank you again, Karl van Holdt. Wonderful lecture. Wits is truly fortunate to have such a brilliant, imaginative, critical mind in its midst.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Bourdieu, for that incisive response, and thanks to our inaugurating professor this evening. I think really highlighting again a tradition of scholarliness in the way that you've articulated your thoughts tonight, and certainly showing an intellectual generosity as you've raised new questions for us to ponder, not only about Karl's work, but about the field more broadly. So thank you very, very much again to you. Colleagues, I'm not really going to say much more at this point about the presentation, the content, the response that's been given. But it really is that moment to, I suppose, reflect on where we are right now. We've come out of a very difficult period in South Africa's history, but also in world history. We've not had the opportunity to do much of this kind of face-to-face work. The idea of just spending time with each other in an environment that really relies on face-to-face interaction, on contact, to be able to generate a kind of intellectual climate for a university that is in fact a contact public university. And so it's absolutely great to see you all here this evening, despite the challenges of the last while. I want to thank all of you for attending. I'd like to thank all of you who are joining us online for attending. Again, just wonderful that you all been able to be here. Thank you to our members of our procession. Thank you to Professor Bourdieu. Thank you to our inaugurating speaker and professor this evening, Karl. It's again, you know, we look forward to great things going down the line. We're looking forward to seeing the book. We're looking forward to seeing your thoughts mature even further on all of this. Let me also just say, you know, as I think is important to say at a moment like this, that it is, you know, to have a colleague like you in the faculty, I think is something that has not only enriched me, but I think has enriched many, many other people. And so just to say to you that we're very, very proud to have a professor like yourself in our faculty. I'm sure the School of Social Sciences, where you have many, many colleagues, SWAP, where you've spent a huge amount of time, you know, over the last several years since 2007. I think that they probably share in that pride, and we're thrilled to have you as a colleague and as a professor in the Faculty of Humanities. So congratulations again this evening. I'm going to ask all of you to, at this point, stand. We really are concluding the ceremony this evening. I'm going to invite you all as well to spend some time afterwards, just socializing, catching up, having some refreshments with us, and really just chatting and taking the conversation forward. So thank you very, very much. And that concludes our event for this evening. Thanks.